Hello, everybody. Unit 5 review coming at you with conflict, crisis, and reaction in the late 18th century. All right, so our context for this unit. So, the big concept for this unit is the French Revolution. And so, we'll get to that in due time. But as we're leading into the 1700s, right, 18th century, 1700s, realizing we have, you know, a lot of different types of governments going on in Europe right now. It's not just absolute monarchy. It's not this, just one way of doing things across Europe with these different monarchs in charge. We have different types of governments. And, those ideas are going to spread, and that is going to certainly challenge the status quo. We're full on into colonialism and worldwide trade and just the effects of that, right? Countries are going to get into conflicts not only now in Europe, but in Asia and Africa. Well, Africa soon enough, and of course in the New World, North America, South America. Coming out of the Enlightenment in Europe, and just thinking about how these new conceptions are being applied to society and how those change the way we look at our governments and the way we react to what we deem as tyranny or suppression of rights. And then out of the French Revolution, we'll, kind of preview nationalism and mass politics and how dramatically and fundamentally that has changed democracies and governments. Here we go. 5.2, the rise of global markets. So at this point, Africa is still, coming in the late 1800s, but Europe is, dividing up and colonizing most of the world. And so, for example, Britain has taken almost total control of India now, right? And that is that crown jewel of the British Empire, replacing the United States as that, again, crown jewel. And then the Dutch control the East Indies. Spain, of course, controls a lot of South America. Britain is in North America. France is in North America. But most of the New World and most of Asia, at least in the Indies, is going to be controlled by Europeans for the foreseeable future. 5.3, Britain's ascendancy. So now until we get to World War II, Britain is going to be the world power, right? They replaced France. The age of Louis XIV is over, and now Britain will be at the top of the world as far as economic power, naval power, military power, again, until post-World War I, stuff that won't be on your 2020 AP Euro test. So 7 Years' War, an important war. It's kind of the First World War, fought in Europe, fought in the New World. And it again establishes Britain as superior to France, at least for the moment. And it does make them not only the continental European power, but the colonial power as well, right? Of course, French and Indian War here in the States. 5.4, French Revolution. All right. So obviously this is a big one. I think it's a subject that if you get it on for your DVQ on May 13th, that I think it'd be a good one, because I think this is obviously not a simple subject, but it's one that I think kind of lends itself to knowing a lot about it, right? Because there's all these characters and phases, and it's maybe a little more of a narrative than most of the things we learn about in AP Euro. Anyway, so the long-term causes, right? And you guys wrote an essay about this. The state system and how that's divided up: first, second, third estate, your clergy, your nobility, and then the rest. And the way taxation works, and just that kind of strict caste system of France. We have the effects of Louis XIII, then of course Louis XIV and Louis XV, these decades of strict rule, while they see the varying types of governments developing around them. Never-ending taxation, those wars, those absolutist wars of Louis XIV, and just the constant oppression of those taxes. When we're thinking about the philosophes, early, those thinkers, Locke, Rousseau, and just how those ideas, you have to apply them to your present situation, right? Those liberal, philosophical, breaking away from strong central authority and, giving people a right of representation, those things, certainly those are going to be applied coming out of the Enlightenment. So the short-term causes, the 7 Years' War had just ended. It was not a positive for France, very expensive. The American Revolution, when the French helped the American colonists, that's very expensive. More taxes for the Third Estate. And then you get the revolt, right? Then you have the storming of the Bastille and all that. And so remembering your phases of the revolution, that even though eventually we get to the beheadings and the guillotine and Robespierre and Napoleon, it kind of has those, quote unquote, humble beginnings, where early on it is just the desire for a constitutional monarchy to limit the power or check the power of King Louis XVI, right? And so early on, that liberal phase of the revolution, that is certainly going to be led by the bourgeoisie, the wealthy upper middle class, the educated class of France, who is going to demand more political and economic rights because they see themselves as being limited by a very small sliver of society, right? The nobility has their own economic goals in mind, and they certainly clash with those of the commoner bourgeoisie class. So, that is a successful revolution. Louis XVI accepts the Constitution, then he tries to run away, and then he gets arrested and eventually beheaded, right? And so when that happens, eventually you have the rise of the radical faction of the Mountain, right, of Robespierre. And that is whenever, when we did the Republican calendar DBQ a couple weeks ago, and that's going to be, again, the erasing of previous French history, right? That ancien regime, or however that may be pronounced. But, removing any remnants of the previous way of life in France, any previous, monarchs or religions or anything have to go away, right? Because this marks year one of the new French Republic. And so obviously this would be a radical thing because not a lot of people in France are going to agree to this, right? Not a lot of people in France are going to go along with having their religion taken away and having to learn a new calendar and, throwing out centuries and centuries and centuries of tradition and everything else. So this goes on for some months, right? And then the Thermidorian reaction is when the government gets rid of Robespierre and eventually the Directory takes over, right? And so kind of knowing these phases, I can't imagine there being the DBQ about just one of these phases, but knowing the French Revolution is a long-term thing and isn't just, boom, revolution, kind of like the American Revolution, right? They declare independence, they fight a war, it's over, and now America is a country. Not that there weren't disagreements and things like that, but certainly it's not as complicated and as nuanced and doesn't develop in these different ways like the French Revolution does, right? So French Revolution is a long-term event, or a large-scale event. Tiny bit more, right? So France, especially once they have removed the king, they start kind of widening the net on who they are going to enlist into the army, right? So levy en masse, right? They're going to have gigantic armies now, rather than just kind of this almost soldier class that existed in a lot of Europe for so long. Now there is, again, this wider scale. This is only possible with weapons of that time, right? It's not going to be necessarily swords and things and pikes like it was in the 1300s and 1400s. Now we have muskets and gunpowder and everything else, and you don't have to be all that well trained to fire some of those things. And so the connection, though, of that nationalism, if I fight for my country and I'm going to be shot at and someone's going to try to kill me because of the country I represent, I probably have a little more patriotism than the guy that came before me, right? If I never fight for the country and all I do is associate armies as mercenaries or, associated with their local lords or whatever, that's not going to help me feel more French in this instance. But if the French government gives me a gun and gives me a uniform and feeds me and pays me, I feel pretty French right about now, right? So as we get into the 1800s, this kind of wide-scale psychological feeling of I belong to a nation now. I'm in a country of people like me, right? And we have a lot of the same values and same desires and everything else. The effects of the French Revolution. So this is a pretty short one, but there is the slave revolt in Saint-Domingue, or what is now Haiti, right? And then the big picture here, though, is kind of the split on how people are going to look at the French Revolution. On one hand, the liberal movement of the revolution is going to inspire a lot of other revolutions in Europe and the world. And a lot of people are going to see that as a good thing, obviously, combating despotism, combating absolute monarchy. But on the other hand, right, if you take the other side of this, a lot of violence, a lot of chaos comes out of this. A lot of radical ideas are going to be born out of this, and kind of balancing those two things, right? Freedom was wonderful, and having, again, these ideas, these enlightened ideas from the French Revolution applied to societies is great in theory, but as we well know, there are some limitations to that and some downsides to that. And again, that balance, like everything else, of how you look at the French Revolution, its impact on history. And like that last little part says, complete dismissal of traditional authority. On one hand, even if you kind of resist or resent certain authorities, when they're around for centuries, that means a lot of people do respect them, right? And they mean a lot to people, and they give a lot of people comfort or safety or peace, or the feeling of it anyway. And that's important in a society, right? And it's hard to get people to forget those things. And obviously the radical phase of the French Revolutions is an example of that, right? You can't just snap your fingers and say, forget yours and your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents and on, and forget all of your religions and culture and everything else because we say so, right? That's not a very good argument. All right, so Napoleon, he gets his own key concept. And so remember, he is a general, kind of a boy wonder, so to speak, in the French army. He starts off as being one of the consuls, and then eventually names himself emperor. And then he starts to take over most of Europe, right? And he starts kind of farming out his brothers to be rulers of these countries. And so Napoleon, I'm gonna take a drink of water here. I got the OSU hat, OSU cup. But, the complicated part of Napoleon, and maybe this is, I think, a good topic for a DBQ, is kind of talking about where his political stances, so to speak, right? Was he an enlightened monarch? Was he more of an absolute monarch? How would you categorize Napoleon? And he's, a mix, obviously, like most people are, but he's a little more extreme than most in that, he's, I shouldn't say extreme, but a little more right in the middle. So keeping certain ideals of the French Revolution, right? Abolishing the estate system. Like it says there, widespread improving of education, bringing back the Catholic Church as, it's not superior to Napoleon for sure, but, embracing that this is a Catholic, or at least a Christian country. The opposite of that would be bringing back slavery, right? And the slave revolt comes directly out of that. He is not, as far as equal rights between men and women. But this question was an SAQ a while back, and the question was, was he a traditionalist or a conservative, or was he a liberal? And of course, the answer, he had elements of both, right? And so a big part, of course, you only get 5 documents on the DBQ, but a big part of that is going to be, you'll probably have to kind of answer 2 sides of the question, right? Because it'll be, was it a secular or a religious thing? Was it a political thing or a economic thing, or whatever, right? And I would guess that of the 5 documents, you'll have 2 on one side and kind of 3 on the other, to some degree, I think. And so if you do get this question, right, kind of look for, he was this, but also he had elements of this, right? That's what they're wanting you to do, to show that you have a nuanced answer. So results of this, right? If you are Spanish or Italian or from Naples or whatever, and all of a sudden a Bonaparte brother is your king, You probably won't like that, right? And so Napoleon might see himself as a liberator, but to other people, he's just a conqueror. And so while we have the rise of nationalism in France because of the larger armies and the French Revolution and representative government there for a little while, kind of ironically, I suppose, Napoleon is going to spread that nationalism all over Europe, but of course it's going to be their local nationalism, be that Spanish or Italian or whatever that may be, right? Because I'm going to resist a foreign monarch being placed on my throne. And nothing's going to make me more aware that I'm, say, from Naples than if I have a French guy ruling me. And then me and my fellow, what would you be, Neapolitans, we would start realizing we have that in common, right? We might have differences, political differences or whatever that is, but certainly we have more in common with each other than we do with that foreign monarch. Eventually Napoleon is defeated, right? Twice, both the first time and after his flee from Elba during his 100 days. But another great example, just like Louis XIV, of that balance of power diplomacy, that pretty much every country in Europe joins forces to defeat Napoleon, because while they might not like all their temporary allies, they certainly don't want to all be conquered by Napoleon, right? I'd rather I exist with 20 other countries than Napoleon take over all of us, right? Okay, 5.7, the Congress of Vienna, post-Napoleon, after he's defeated for the second time. So this is when all of the monarchs of Europe, right, they are seeking to maintain the status quo, to prevent revolution, not only just in France, but anywhere, right? Because those ideas certainly are going to spread. They don't just happen in a vacuum. And it's that kind of idea of, even if I'm, say, the king of, I don't know, Prussia, and I really don't like France at all, I still don't want the king of France to be beheaded and destroyed, because then maybe my subjects get that idea, right? And so, yes, I might not like you, but I do have something to benefit from as far as if you stay in power and your society stays consistent, right, and stable. So as far as France goes, they have the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. Louis XVIII is now in charge and will be for a little while. And so the French Revolution, of course, obviously there's some very important things that happened in between from 1789 to 1815, but, you know, they trade a monarchy for a monarchy, right? And of course, it's, you know, it's an absolute monarchy, briefly a constitutional monarchy before Louis XVI ran away, and then Louis XVIII will come in with the constitution, I believe. I don't want to be wrong. I'll have to double check that. But there's a lot of, again, those phases in Napoleon and everything else in between, important to know, right? Last one, 5.8, Romanticism. So as far as societal or as art goes, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, criticism of it is that it sort of almost turned us into like something to study, right? Like we were a science project, and we were resisting or rejecting our human emotions because we were trying so hard to be rational, and kind of, again, rejecting our humanity a little bit. And so some of the results of this are going to be, as far as religion goes, where people start again to embrace that sort of personal relationship with their God, right? That I don't need a intermediary to tell me how to believe and what to do and how to pray and what my rituals are and everything. I just kind of feel it. And I have, you know, a church of one, so to speak, that I'm the one worshiper in my church, and I feel like I'm right. And I don't need, not that I don't need spiritual leadership or anything, or have a mentor, but certainly I have my own personal feeling, my own personal relationship, right? And so, again, embracing those kind of human innate emotions that sometimes we get angry and mad and sad and happy and everything in between, and we don't have to always take a deep breath and get back to our center, right? Sometimes we can embrace those things. When we have this new feeling of, again, patriotism and nationalism, and we now have widespread voting, at least for men, you know, that is going to, again, give you a sense of belonging that you didn't have before. And if you're a peasant in the 1500s, I mean, you have zero power, right? You are unbelievably expendable. Kings, besides make sure they have food for everybody, have no real obligation to make sure you're happy, because you can't vote them out. You can't unionize. You can't do any of these things that might change political, or at least challenge political power. But if you have a vote all of a sudden, and you're a voting bloc, and the government is not feeding you or has taxed you too much, and you can vote people in and out of power, that changes your self-perception, right? It changes not only that you feel part of a country, but suddenly people who vote a different way than you, that's going to cause some complications too, right? And so you start having these political divisions as well, that political parties are going to have to maneuver, and presidents and kings and everything else are going to have to maneuver through as well. Okay, so that is it. Unit 5. Thank you, guys.